What a marvelous age we live in.
Hot feet, fire in the middle. Hot feet, warm as griddle. Hot feet, sizzling soup. Oh, what will I do? Whack, dilly bop bop bop. Hot feet, stinging like a busy bee. Hot feet, smoke like a chimney. Hot heat, burning terribly, nearly makes a furnace out of me. Hot feet, and I want to be hot, 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 hot. White heat, that's the way they have got. Hot feet, Charleston's dune. Shot feet, black bottom ruined 'em. Hot feet, hear him yell, oh, what's so hot heat?
The 1920s was before the 1930s, but after 1919. It lasted for 10 years. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But mainly, the Roaring Twenties was a decade filled with innovation and a profound change of culture that altered America's beliefs and traditions forever. In the 1920s, a new generation of writers surfaced that differed greatly from the previous traditional Protestant New England authors that had controlled American cultural life. These writers exemplified the newfound energy of the youth, ambition of outcasts and outsiders, and the breaking of tradition and strongly held beliefs within society. This literature breathed vitality and was created with an artistic quality highlighted by these writers' grand imaginations and new ideals. One of the many iconic authors of this time was F. Scott Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald crafted two masterpieces during this time, which were This Side of Paradise and The Great Gatsby. More famous of the two was The Great Gatsby, a novel which perfectly captured the ambiance and society of the 1920s. The Great Gatsby focuses on a man named Jay Gatsby, who climbed his way to the top in order to gain the affections of the woman he was hopelessly in love with, Daisy Buchanan. The Great Gatsby highlighted the excesses of the 1920s, an age of sheer prosperity, scandal, and consumerism, which led to a new society, one in which abandoned previously upheld beliefs and traditions. Many of the authors of this time were greatly influenced by the war. One of these authors is the late Ernest Hemingway. Using simple language and words to convey his ideas, Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, published in 1926, depicted life after war. It discusses life about war veteran Jake Barnes and how he's unable to consummate his relationship with his love interest, Brett, due to a war injury. Hemingway's novel explores the defining disillusion young people faced after their lives were profoundly affected by the war. Another author that had a large influence in this decade was Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes. Hughes refused to differentiate between his personal experience and the common experience of Black America. He published two poetry collections during this time, which included The Weary Blues and Fine Clothes to the Jew. Hughes wanted to tell the stories of his people in ways that reflected their actual culture, such as their suffering and their love of music, laughter, and language itself. The music industry within the 1920s underwent a huge change. This decade marked the beginning of independent record companies. These smaller organizations were not afraid or intimidated to take a chance on music and artists that the bigger companies initially shied away from. A new genre of music emerged in the 1920s, known as jazz. Originated in New Orleans, the genre began to spread in the later part of the decade. Jazz appealed to the public so much because it broke the rules of traditional music. It allowed musicians to improvise their catchy tunes, and the rhythms caught listeners' attention. Many jazz artists, including Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, that define this period were a part of the Harlem Renaissance. Ellington is known as one of the best composers of his time, whereas Armstrong is remembered for his iconic trumpet playing. Art in the 1920s was clearly marked by a modernism that became the norm in this time period. Modern art was and is the representation of the world that is not literal. During artists began to create new and innovative ways to reveal how they depicted the world. Some artists adopted the geometric aesthetic of the precisionist movement, while others explored or created new styles. An important and influential artist of this time was Georgia O'Keeffe. O'Keeffe's most famous portraits are Black Iris and Oriental Poppies. These portraits portrayed her vivid, powerful, and private sensibility in natural objects such as flowers, clouds, and most notably, animal skulls and bones. Other artists embraced the modernist movement in different ways. Artists such as Stuart Davis used the consumer culture to influence his abstract style that resembled collages and synthetic cubism. Davis utilized flat, overlapping shapes and patterns through household products. Examples of Davis's style can be seen in his 1921 painting, Lucky Strike, and his 1927 Egg Beater series. Other artists embraced the modernist movement through precisionist art. Artist Charles Sealer painted buildings with hard edges, simplified geometric forms, and earth-toned colors based off of pictures of different architecture.
In the 1920s, athletics rose in popularity and importance. Sports went from amateur events to an opportunity to capitalize and make money. During the decade, athletics expanded to the creation of school teams as well as into the middle class. This time span is where water skiing and greyhound racing began. It also saw the first Winter Olympic Games in 1924, which involved a total of 9 sport events and neared 10,004 paying spectators. Record-breaking athletes emerged such as Bobby Jones, who won 13 championships in his golfing career and by the end of the decade became the only golfer to ever win the U.S. Amateur, British Amateur, British Open, and U.S. Open in the same year. There is also Glenna Collette, who in 1924 won a total of 59 out of 60 matches. This woman also held a record of winning 6 U.S. Women's Amateur Championships, 2 Canadian Women's Amateurs, and a French Women's Amateur. In tennis, there was Bill Tilden, who won a record of 7 U.S. championships, had 7 consecutive victorious American Davis Cup slugs, and held the number 1 American ranking 10 times. Another great tennis player, Helen Wills, collected 8 Wimbledon singles titles, winning 50 of 51 in Britain. At the U.S. Championship, she took the singles title 7 times. Both secured a total of 19 Grand Slam singles championships. Successful Notre Dame football coach Knute Rockne held a record of 105 wins, 12 losses, and 5 ties in his time as a coach and was seen as an inspiration of the decade. Football player Red Grange was an All-American in 1923 through 1925 and was given the first Chicago Tribune Silver Football Award in 1924 for the Big Ten. There is also swimmer Johnny Weissmuller, who won gold medals in the 100-meter and 400-meter freestyle and 4x200-meter freestyle relay events at the 1924 Paris Summer Games, and as well as a gold medal in the 100-meter freestyle and 4x200-meter freestyle relay events at the 1928 Amsterdam Summer Games. Weissmuller also was the winner of 52 national championships. Baseball hero Babe Ruth was traded for $125,000 in 1920 to the New York Yankees. And within the decade, he broke his own record by scoring 60 home runs in just one season. Boxer Jack Dempsey was a 1920s hero for obtaining the World Heavyweight Championship in 1919 and holding on to it for 5 years into the 20s. Women saw success in athletics as well. In 1926, Gertrude Ederle, a woman swam the English Channel for the first time, and in 1928 the Summer Olympics welcomed women's athletics and gymnastics. Sports brought the American people together. The events gave family and friends something to enjoy and bond over. The 20s shined a light on athletes still viewed as heroes within their sport in today's society.
September 30th. Thousands come hoping to see Ruth hit the 60th home run that will break his record. But in 3 trips to the plate, the babe doesn't do it. The season is almost over. It's now the 8th inning of the game with the Washington Senators, and it will be Ruth's last time at bat. Washington's Tom Zachary gets ready. Strike 1 is called. It's high, a ball. Zachary gets ready. The babe has done it. 60 home runs in one season. One of the greatest records in baseball.
The success of the automobile heavily impacted the culture of the 20s. Though there were 3 big producers, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, the boom in the car industry came from Ford with Ford Model T. By 1928, 20% of all Americans had owned a car. The reason behind the success of this industry lays behind the automobile's affordability. Mass production dropped prices significantly. Every company had to build its own cheap cars to compete with one another, and the benefits went to the consumer. With cars becoming an American norm, hotels, garages, and restaurants sprung up along with the construction of new roads. These outlets employed many and steered people away from their homes. The first broadcast of a commercial radio station aired on November 2, 1920 at Westinghouse Corporation's KDKA, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and reports on the Harding-Cox presidential election results. By 1923, 3 million Americans owned radios, and there were around 550 stations. Early on, listeners used crystal headsets with earphones to receive news and bulletins, advertising, and music. The program later expanded into stock market and weather reports, comedy, and major sporting events. In the mid-1920s, a significant portion of radio stations were operated by non-profit organizations, colleges, and universities. The radio brought politicians into the American home. Many went to learn effective public speaking. Many actors and actresses did this as well with the rise of talking movies. The radio became an American home necessity by the end of the decade. They even put it in cars in 1929. It improved communication and American entertainment and is a large contribution to the culture of the time. The real birth of movies came with the rise of the 20th century. With the turn of the century, the movie industry was launched into reality. Hollywood was born in Southern California, becoming the mecca for all things movie-related. 5-cent movie theaters Nickelodeon sprouted all over the U.S., showcasing nudity and female vampires, or vamps. The age of silent movies came to a halting end as sound-filled, newly colored-filled theaters everywhere. Movie stars collected salaries multiplicatively higher than the president. Many actors and actresses were vastly more widely known than political leaders, making them more influential than representatives. Before the start of World War I, the Gibson Girl was the rage. Inspired by Charles Raymond Gibson's drawings, the Gibson Girl wore her long hair loosely on top of her head and wore a long straight skirt and a shirt with a high collar. She was feminine but also broke through several gender barriers, for her attire allowed her to participate in sports, including golf, roller skating, and bicycling. When the war was over, the survivors went home, and the world tried to return to normalcy. Unfortunately, settling down in peacetime proved more difficult than expected. During the war, the boys had fought against both the enemy and death in faraway lands. The girls had bought into the patriotic fervor and aggressively entered the workforce. During the war, both the boys and the girls of this generation had broken out of society's structure. They found it very difficult to return. Women were just as anxious as the men to avoid returning to society's rules and roles after the war. In the age of the Gibson girl, young women did not date. They waited until a proper young man formally paid her interest with suitable intentions such as marriage. However, nearly a whole generation of young men had died in the war, leaving nearly a whole generation of young women without possible suitors. Young women decided that they were not willing to waste their young lives waiting idly for spinsterhood. They were going to enjoy life. The younger generation was breaking away from the old set of values. The flapper's image consisted of drastic, to some shocking, changes in women's clothing and hair. Nearly every article of clothing was trimmed down and lightened in order to make movement easier. The outer clothing of flappers is still extremely identifiable. This look, called garçon, or little boy, was instigated by Coco Chanel. To look more like a boy, women tightly round their chest in strips of cloth in order to flatten it. The waist of flapper clothes were dropped to the hip line. She wore stockings made of rayon, or artificial silk, starting in 1923, which the flapper often wore rolled over a garter belt. The hem of the skirts also started to rise in the 1920s. At first the hem only rose a few inches, but from 1925 to 1927 a flapper skirt fell just below the knee. Flappers also started wearing makeup, some that had previously been only worn by loose women. Rouge, powder, eyeliner, and lipstick became extremely popular. The flapper attitude was characterized by stark truthfulness, fast living, and sexual behavior. Flappers seemed to cling to youth as if it was going to leave them at any moment. They took risks and were reckless. Dating. It's not calling for a mate or looking for someone to have an adult, sexual, and emotional relationship. It's about having fun with a member of the opposite sex. Dating is deciding whether to flirt with a certain person, how far along it can go, and how much sexual intimacy will be allowed. The 1920s was a point in history where gender roles and stereotypes were first weaved into the fabric of society. Dating is highly gendered now. It is the boy's responsibility to ask the girl out, pay for the date, and be the one to provide transportation. However, they will expect some physical attention in return. No longer does the male have to go to the female's house. They are now both able to go out, which requires spending money. As for the girl, it is her responsibility for being able to keep the physical attention at an appropriate level, and depending on how often a girl is asked out on a date also will determine her popularity level. For the first time, there are no chaperones on dates between males and females. There is finally more freedom, and dates should not require formal commitment to one another. Before, dancing was more of a group activity, where now you will find it's more couple-oriented. Also, cars now are a great place for a couple to have more privacy and intimacy. Although in order to get to this portion of a date, it all depends on popularity and the level of success a person has. This new kind of dating allows each person to get to know each other better, then lead on into a relationship, rather than getting into the relationship first. The focus is now on success and popularity without involving emotions. From this comes a new type of bond called a steady relationship, which is a stage between casualness and marriage. This bond is marked with meaningful rituals, for instance, the sharing of class rings or letter jackets. Romantic love is the only basis for marriage, and you will definitely know when you find the right one. The most revolutionary contribution to educational theory during the 1920s was made by Professor John Dewey. He set forth the principles of learning by doing that formed the foundation of progressive education. Science made great leaps of advances during these years, yet both science and progressive education in the 1920s were subjected to fire by the fundamentalists. Religionists charged that the teaching of Darwinian evolution was destroying faith in God and the Bible, while contributing to the decay of morals in the youth of the age. Multitudes of attempts were made to bar evolution from leaking into the school system, especially in the Bible Belt South. One of the best examples of this is the Scopes Monkey Supreme Court trial, in which a biology teacher was prosecuted for involving evolution in his curriculum. Scopes, the teacher, was prosecuted by William Jennings Bryan. This clash between fundamentalism and modernism was inconclusive, and Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. Although many Christians were coming to realize the importance of the scientific findings, the emphasis in the country stayed with fundamentalism for quite some time.